What if a country's destiny could be altered not by tanks on its streets but by the slow, invisible machinery of dollars, sanctions, and political recognition? What if a nation whose lifeblood is oil could be reshaped by embargoes, asset seizures, and covert influence, all while headlines speak of diplomacy and democracy? This is the story of Venezuela, a nation of extraordinary natural wealth and tragic economic collapse, and of a policy approach that some call pressure, others call interference, and still others call a form of modern geopolitical warfare. In the span of decades, Venezuela went from the world's richest country per capita to an economy in freefall, with millions fleeing, hospitals struggling, and a political system in crisis. Alongside domestic shocks, a sequence of international actions, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and clandestine efforts reported by investigative sources pushed and pulled the country toward a breaking point. This film asks the hard questions. How did Venezuela reach this moment? What role did external actors, especially the United States, play in accelerating collapse? And what are the lessons for a world where power increasingly moves through money, not armies? Stay with me. The answers are not simple, the truth is messy, and the consequences are still unfolding. To understand the modern battle over Venezuela, we have to start with three things: oil revolution and a leader who reshaped both. For most of the 20th century, Venezuelan politics revolved around petroleum. The black gold beneath the nation's soil funded modern infrastructure, social programs, and international prestige. Control of oil revenues became central to political power. By the 1970s, Venezuela was a major OPEC producer and a key supplier of crude to the United States. Into this landscape stepped Hugo Chávez, a charismatic former soldier who led a failed coup in 1992 and rose to the presidency in 1999 on a platform of anti-corruption, social justice, and a rebuke of neoliberalism. Chavez nationalized vast sectors of the economy, notably the oil industry, and used the proceeds to finance ambitious social programs. Supporters praised his redistribution policies. Critics warned of institutions weakened and markets distorted. When Chavez died in 2013, Nicolás Maduro, his vice president and a former bus driver, took the helm. Having inherited a political project centered on oil-funded social spending, Maduro soon faced headwinds: falling oil prices, mismanagement in the state oil company PDVSA, corruption, and a mounting fiscal crisis. Those domestic failures collided with a changing global environment and a more assertive U.S. foreign policy. Key international actors appear throughout this story: the United States and its successive administrations, regional neighbors such as Colombia and Brazil, Russia and China as strategic partners, and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and Organization of American States. Each had incentives and tools, and each made decisions that rippled across Venezuelan society. But the most consequential set of actions, and the ones we will examine in detail, are those taken by the U.S., an array of economic sanctions, diplomatic recognition decisions, and reportedly covert operations that combined to shape Venezuela's trajectory in the 2010s. Before we dive into the sequence, we need context. Sanctions are not a blunt instrument. They come in degrees: targeted asset freezes, oil bans, sectoral sanctions on oil sales, restrictions on access to international banking, and penalties on third-party intermediaries. In an interconnected world, even carefully targeted measures can have broad, sometimes unintended consequences. Now let's tell the story chronologically so we can see cause and effect, the origins, the rise, the breaking point, the fallout, and the attempts to fix what had been broken. The origins of contemporary U.S. Venezuela tension trace back decades, but several moments stand out. First, the Chavez era transformed Venezuela's foreign posture. Chavez cultivated ties with states often at odds with Washington: Cuba, Iran, and later Russia and China. He reoriented Venezuela's diplomacy into a more assertive anti-U.S. posture, both ideological and practical. Caracas began bartering oil for political support, financing leftist governments across Latin America, and supporting international causes that ran counter to U.S. interests. Second, the U.S. retaliated in diplomatic and economic ways. The relationship oscillated, sometimes confrontational, sometimes managed tension, but mutual distrust grew. U.S. officials criticized human rights abuses, erosion of democratic norms, and the undermining of electoral institutions in Venezuela. Chavez and Maduro, for their part, accused the U.S. of economic sabotage and conspiracies. Third, the global oil market shifted. From 2014 onward, oil prices collapsed from over $100 a barrel to below $40. For resource-dependent Venezuela, the shock was devastating. Plunging revenues coincided with years of mismanagement at PDVSA, declining production, inadequate investment, and the siphoning off of funds through patronage and corruption. The economy contracted sharply. Within this context, sanctions began to appear as a tool of policy. In 2014, the U.S. imposed targeted sanctions on a few Venezuelan officials for alleged human rights abuses and corruption. These were relatively narrow, travel bans, asset freezes on select individuals. But the use of sanctions escalated. Between 2017 and 2019, successive rounds of sanctions targeted the Venezuelan oil sector, the economy's backbone. The Treasury Department used authority to restrict transactions with PDVSA, to sanction routes for oil financing, and to pressure nations and companies participating in Venezuela's oil trade. The aim, stated by U.S. officials, was to force political change, to target Maduro's inner circle and make the regime unsustainable, compelling a transition to democratic governance. That stated rationale sets up a key tension of the story. Sanctions are often billed as a way to punish leaders while sparing ordinary citizens. In practice, when a country's revenues and supply chains are deeply intertwined with the global financial system, sectoral sanctions can shrink import capacity, reduce medicines and food imports, and accelerate humanitarian declines. The debate over effectiveness and morality became central to the Venezuela saga. Understanding both intent and effect, the declared goal to pressure the regime versus the humanitarian toll on the population will be a persistent theme as we trace the events that followed. As sanctions intensified, so did political polarization inside Venezuela and diplomatic efforts abroad. Caracas increasingly relied on bilateral partners that were willing to resist U.S. pressure. Notably, Russia and China. Moscow provided security cooperation, energy sector assistance, and loans. Beijing extended lines of credit tied to oil shipments. Those partnerships helped the Maduro government survive at certain junctures, but they also deepened Venezuela's economic entanglements and political isolation. So, at home, political opposition mobilized. Alternating rounds of protests, elections, and repression unfolded. In 2018, Maduro ran for president in a vote that many international observers criticized as neither free nor fair. In January 2019, the opposition leader Juan Guaido, head of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president, citing constitutional provisions, and was soon recognized as such by the United States and more than 50 countries. This dramatic move escalated pressure on Maduro and crystallized international alignments. The recognition of Guaido marked a turning point. The U.S. and European partners transferred diplomatic recognition and, crucially, the control of certain Venezuelan assets abroad, including funds in foreign banks and stakes in joint ventures, to Guaido's representatives. The stated purpose was to deprive Maduro of financial resources and to support the opposition's interim government. Behind those official maneuvers, media reports and investigative accounts described an intensification of covert actions. Journalists reporting on leaks, former officials speaking anonymously, and think tank analyses surfaced accounts of planning and support for clandestine operations, efforts to encourage defections in the military, to coordinate with opposition networks inside Venezuela, and to prepare contingency plans ranging from non-violent disruption to more direct actions. Some of these reports were later confirmed in part, while other claims remained unverified or were disputed by officials. It is critical to be precise here. Allegations of covert operations do not equate to proof of wrongdoing. Democracies have a history of using clandestine tools in foreign policy, but the degree, transparency, and legal oversight differ by case. For Venezuela, the surge of reported covert planning created the perception of an active proxy struggle, the U.S. employing financial, diplomatic, and presumably clandestine levers, Russia and China countering with strategic lifelines, the Venezuelan state entrenching itself through allied institutions and security forces. The effect of recognition and asset freezes unfolded quickly. With oil revenues cut by sanctions and operational degradation at PDVSA, imports of medicines, food, and industrial inputs became more sporadic. Hyperinflation, already severe, accelerated. Public services collapsed in many areas. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country, creating one of the hemisphere's largest migration crises. In Washington, proponents of sanctions argued they were targeted, reversible, and necessary, a middle ground between military intervention and diplomatic inaction. Critics argued that sanctions acted like a blunt instrument. They magnified suffering, empowered autocratic narratives, and hardened the positions that made negotiation harder. Which brings us to the breaking point. The breaking point emerged as multiple crises converged: economic collapse, political stalemate, mounting humanitarian needs, and external pressure. For many Venezuelans, daily life became a struggle for survival. Hospitals reported shortages of sick supplies, blackouts, and water interruptions became routine. The collapse of productive capacity meant jobs disappeared, purchasing power evaporated. Internationally, Venezuela's stalemate evolved into a diplomatic contest. The U.S. doubled down on recognizing Guaido, while Russia, China, Turkey, and others backed Maduro. Negotiations occurred intermittently, often mediated by regional actors, yet durable solutions remained elusive. A particularly symbolic moment came when the U.S. imposed secondary sanctions penalties on third-party actors who continued to do business with Venezuela. These measures sought to choke off remaining avenues of revenue and to isolate the regime financially. Critics warned that secondary sanctions would push Venezuela even further into the orbit of those willing to defy U.S. policy, deepening geopolitical fragmentation. Concurrently, investigative reporting detailed alleged clandestine plots aimed at toppling Maduro. Some journalists described purported contact between Venezuelan dissidents, exiles, and private contractors with ties to foreign intelligence services. Others reported attempts to smuggle in weapons or to coordinate small targeted raids. A few operations, according to public accounts, were intercepted or failed. The reality is that in any prolonged crisis, desperate actors will undertake a wide range of tactics from peaceful protests to armed resistance. External supporters may offer technical advice, training, or logistical aid. Where such external support crosses legal and ethical lines, for example, where it violates sovereignty or amounts to covert action without legislative oversight, democracies have an obligation to scrutinize and debate. Whatever the precise mix of covert and overt measures, the cumulative effect was clear. Venezuelan institutions further degraded, humanitarian conditions worsening, and political polarization deepening. The state's coercive apparatus hardened, trust between citizens and institutions frayed. In 2019 and the years that followed, the hoped-for rapid transition to an opposition-led government did not occur. Instead, a protracted stalemate set in, an internationalized crisis without a simple exit. At home, the population bore the brunt. The fallout from these years is still raw. Millions of Venezuelans sought refuge in neighboring countries and beyond regional host states. Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and others face strains on public services, labor markets, and social cohesion. International organizations mobilized to provide humanitarian assistance, but funding gaps and politicization slowed delivery. Economically, Venezuela's productive base contracted sharply. Years of underinvestment and sanctions on oil, plus the attrition of skilled labor, left the energy industry functioning at a fraction of its former capacity. That decline reduced the state's ability to finance public services and social programs, reinforcing a cycle of scarcity. Politically, the crisis led to a reconfiguration of alliances. Russia expanded its military and energy partnerships with Venezuela. China deepened financial ties through loans and development projects. Non-Western actors leveraged Venezuela's predicament to assert influence, undermining the Western consensus that had initially backed Guaido. The result was a geopolitical realignment in which Venezuela became a stage for broader great power competition. Domestically, political repression increased at times. While opposition groups fractured under pressure and internal disagreements. Internationally, the moral clarity of initial condemnations blurred as the costs and unintended consequences of pressure became evident. Human rights organizations documented abuses by both state and non-state actors. The legitimacy of domestic institutions from courts to electoral authorities was questioned. Meanwhile, everyday Venezuelans navigated a reality of scarcity, uncertainty, and migration. Let's be candid. The policies that sought to hasten political change did not produce the rapid transition many advocates envisioned. They did, however, exact a heavy price on the population. Whether the international community could have paired pressure with more robust humanitarian mechanisms, credible negotiation platforms, and clearer contingency planning is a central question of this story. Over time, multiple attempts were made to resolve the crisis. There were rounds of negotiations, some mediated by Norway or other neutral parties seeking pathways to free elections and a political settlement. At times, international pressure relaxed in hope of compromise. At others, new sanctions tightened leverage. One failed fix was the over-reliance on recognition without sufficient on-the-ground leverage. Recognizing a challenger in exile or in parliament can send a powerful signal, but without viable mechanisms to translate that recognition into meaningful governance capacity, it risks creating a shadow government without control or public services. In Venezuela, this dynamic left the opposition with legitimacy in some capitals but limited practical authority inside the country. Another failed fix was the narrow focus on financial pressure without calibrated humanitarian safeguards. Sanctions architects often designed exemptions for food and medicine, but in tightly linked financial systems, banks and insurers sometimes de-risked Venezuela entirely to avoid compliance costs, thereby blocking legitimate humanitarian flows. In short, legal exemptions do not always translate into practical access. Third, there was a failure of comprehensive strategic planning. Policy options were often reactive and disjointed. A sanction imposed here, a diplomatic recognition there, a covert plan somewhere else. The absence of a unified, transparent strategy that integrated diplomatic outreach, humanitarian assistance, and clear exit options allowed chaos to proliferate and made unintended consequences more likely. Finally, the international community's inability to forge a cohesive multilateral approach undermined efforts. While many Western countries followed U.S. policy, others pursued different courses, creating openings for external supporters of Maduro to provide financial and geopolitical relief. These failed fixes teach a painful lesson. In complex political crises, isolated measures, however well-intended, can compound harm when not embedded in a comprehensive strategy that prioritizes civilian welfare and negotiates exit ramps for combatants. What happened in Venezuela echoes patterns we've seen elsewhere. First, the weaponization of economic sanctions have become a staple foreign policy tool for many democracies. They are attractive because they can be applied without direct military intervention and can target elites. But as we've seen in other contexts, Iraq under sanctions in the 1990s, Iran's time under heavy penalties, or Russia after 2014, the humanitarian and political spillovers can be severe. The Venezuelan case shows how sanctions interact with domestic mismanagement to produce outcomes arguably worse than either force alone might. Second, the interplay of ideology and geopolitics. When ideological polarity, whether anti-communist, anti-authoritarian, or anti-Washington, frames a crisis, options narrow, allies rally, opponents dig in. External patrons provide lifelines, turning domestic crises into geopolitical competitions. The result, frozen conflicts with humanitarian costs. Third, the limits of recognition and symbolic politics. Recognizing an opposition leader can create diplomatic pressure, but it cannot magically replace the capacity to govern or the complex web of institutions required to deliver services. Symbolic steps matter, but they need to be paired with operational plans. Fourth, the migration test. When states fail to provide economic security, migration follows, regional neighbors face strains, and global governance tests are triggered. The Venezuela exodus revealed how fragile regional coordination can be, and how crises at the margins of major powers can become shared continental burdens. Finally, the question of accountability. In many crises, actors claim moral high ground while also deploying methods that create harm. Democracies that pride themselves on human rights must wrestle with the ethical calculus of pressure. How to punish abusive regimes without punishing their people? Sanctions are powerful but blunt instruments. They can reshape elite behavior when carefully targeted, but when economies are fragile and institutions weak, sanctions risk amplifying human suffering and empowering alternative patrons. Diplomacy must be strategic and comprehensive. Recognition, coercion, and covert measures cannot substitute for long-term credible political settlement mechanisms that reconcile governance, security, and humanitarian needs. Humanitarian foresight is not optional. When external pressure is applied, planners must anticipate and mitigate civilian harm by ensuring banking access for humanitarian flows, protecting supply chains for basic goods, and coordinating regional support for displaced populations. As the world grows more interconnected, the tools of power are changing. Money, finance, and diplomacy can all be turned into instruments of pressure. That power can avert war or it can wound millions. In Venezuela, we witnessed the tragic calculus when policy aims, geopolitical rivalry, and domestic collapse intersected. The open question is stark. In a world where coercive economic tools are normalized, what norms will govern their use? Who will bear the cost when tools meant to punish elites fall on everyday people? And how will the international community rebuild systems of accountability and care to prevent similar tragedies? There are no easy answers, but there is an imperative to learn from the Venezuela experience to design policy that centers human dignity as much as geopolitical ends. If this film changed how you see international power, share it. Read more, support evidence-based humanitarian responses, and demand accountability from your leaders when they choose pressure over diplomacy. Because if we want better outcomes in places like Venezuela, we must insist that our policies are not only strategic but humane. This documentary was produced to explore the facts, raise difficult questions, and invite careful debate. Sources included public records, international reporting, and analysis from scholars and humanitarian organizations. Where claims were contested, we have used cautious language and highlighted the complexities. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more in-depth documentaries that examine the forces shaping our shared world.